thanks to all of you, and the number is increasing by the second here of participants. Those of you who were in on a call in the run-up to the Paris meeting almost broke records. The number that had signed up to participate in this one blasted through any prior records that the Roundtable had for these kind of telephone briefing sessions. Again, this is Rich Goodstein. I'm really thrilled to introduce live from Prague, where he's found the ability to kind of get away after having been in the weeds in Paris for 2 weeks, Elliot Diringer, who is the Executive Vice President of the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, which some of you may still know as a predecessor group to the Pew Center on Global Climate Change. And since joining C2ES many years ago, Elliot's emphasis has been on international strategies. Elliot's been in the thick of the global climate issues for over 30 years, first as a reporter. He actually covered the 1992 Earth Summit in Rio, then in the Clinton White House, in which capacity he was a member of the U.S. delegations to several international climate negotiations, and since then with Pew and now C2ES, where he has attended these COP meetings as religiously as anybody. I would say, there are very, very few people in Washington or in the country who are following and have followed the issues around international climate change, and who participated as much as a kind of hands-on way in the COP21 as did Elliot. Elliot, with that introduction, the floor is yours. Just for people on the line, again, you're used to this. Elliot will do a talk, and then when it's over, we'll open it up for Q&A. Elliot, and just so you know, Elliot, although this was called to end at 3, if there are questions, and this happened last time, that take us beyond that, Elliot is available, so I don't want to presuppose anything, but just so people know, they'll be able to get their questions in if we hit 3 and they haven't gotten to you yet. Elliot, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Rich, for that kind introduction, and thanks to you and the Business Roundtable for organizing and hosting this briefing. And thanks to all those who are calling in. Really appreciate the level of interest we're seeing. I'm sorry I haven't had a chance to prepare any slides that you can follow along with, but I believe you will have received our summary of the Paris outcome. If not, you can find it at our website, c2es.org. And I'd like to start with some high-level observations, move into some of the particulars of the Paris Agreement. I think that what was achieved in Paris does represent a fundamental shift in this global climate effort, which has been underway for more than 2 decades now. Simply as a moment, I think it's quite possibly profound. We saw a convergence of factors here that delivered the success in Paris. Most importantly, I would say an unprecedented level of political will, which I think reflects a growing recognition worldwide, both of the risks presented by climate change, but also of the economic opportunities in a clean energy transition. That level of political will was perhaps most concretely reflected in the enormous number of countries that submitted nationally determined contributions in the run-up to Paris, more than 180 countries accounting for more than 90% of global emissions. But a second factor, I think, was the broad convergence on the broad contours of the deal that we saw emerging in the year leading up to Paris. And we like to think at C2ES that we actually contributed to that with some intensive informal discussions that we hosted among negotiators from a couple of dozen countries. And a third factor I would cite was the French hosts, who really displayed a masterful management of this process, which all too often can veer out of control. Some real diplomatic finesse there. So those are some of the factors that I think contributed. The outcome, I think, sends some very powerful signals to the marketplace, to governments, to all of us. I personally have hesitated to invoke the word historic only because I think that's a question of lasting effect, of staying power, and really can only be judged in time. But in fact, one of the major thrusts of this agreement is creating a succession of political moments like the one we've just experienced, where the same kind of factors can be brought to bear to keep strengthening action over time. So we certainly hope that it does have that staying power. I think the agreement, among other things, represents a fundamental rebalancing of effort across developed and developing countries. It more or less ends the kind of stark binary differentiation we've seen in the past, most notably in the Kyoto Protocol, and it replaces that with a set of common obligations while still allowing for differentiation, but of a much more nuanced nature. And that differentiation is reflected differently across different elements of the agreement. And I would say most notably in the transparency provisions. And these are critical provisions because that's the means of accountability provided by this agreement. And what it's done there is replace the current bifurcated system with a common system with flexibility. And I'll come back to that. As far as the United States, I think that the U.S. role here was both as a significant driver, but also something of a constraint. From the president on down, we saw a real significant diplomatic effort. They worked it hard. The pair of joint statements between the U.S. and China that we saw over the last year or so were quite telling, but that was not the full extent of it. So I think that much of the credit does go to the U.S. for a very significant diplomatic effort. At the same time, the desire of this administration to ratify the agreement through executive action, in other words, by the president himself, rather than taking it through Congress, kept the deal from going further in some respects, most notably by keeping emissions targets from being legally binding. So with that kind of overview, let me now step into some of the particulars of the agreement. The outcome in Paris is actually a package. You have, on the one hand, the core legal agreement, and then accompanying it, you have a decision, and those have somewhat different effects. That core agreement does constitute a legally binding treaty under international law, though not all of its provisions are binding. What we really have here is a mix of obligations and expectations. And I'll detail some of those. And just to note, this agreement is meant to apply starting in 2020. In broad structure, I would say that this agreement is very much along the lines that we'd anticipated. It's what we describe as a hybrid approach. It is significant flexibility provided to parties, and that helps ensure broad participation, as we saw with that flood of NDCs coming in. And it combines that flexibility or complements it with a set of rules and expectations to provide both for accountability and to promote strong ambition.
Elliot, if I can interrupt you 1 second.
The agreement.
Elliot, if I can, just when you use terms like NDCs, because we have people, some of whom are in the weeds and some aren't, if you could just kind of spell them out, I think that would probably make sure that everybody's on the same page.
Thanks for that, Rich, and that will be the only acronym I believe that I will employ. Okay. NDC, Nationally Determined Contribution. So the agreement sets a long-term goal. Actually, it reaffirms the existing goal of keeping warming below 2 degrees Celsius. But in addition, in a major victory for developing countries highly vulnerable to climate impacts, it also says that parties should pursue efforts to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. I wouldn't characterize this as a goal per se. I think it's more of a symbolic or political statement recognizing that some countries face some very genuine risks if warming does exceed 1.5 degrees. In terms of mitigation, addressing emissions, the agreement sets a couple of aspirational long-term emission goals. First, it calls for a peaking of emissions as soon as possible while recognizing that that will take longer in developing countries. And then it calls for achieving net greenhouse gas neutrality in the second half of the century. In terms of individual mitigation efforts by countries, the agreement sets out a set of binding procedural commitments. Countries must prepare, communicate, and maintain NDC, again, a nationally determined contribution. They must communicate a new one every 5 years. Those are binding commitments. There is an expectation that each successive NDC will represent a progression beyond the previous, will reflect a party's highest possible ambition. So again, that's where we see expectations being set that will help drive ambition going forward. In addition, the agreement commits parties to, quote, pursue domestic measures with the aim of achieving the objectives, unquote, of their NDCs. But in a key distinction for the United States, the agreement does not make the implementation or achievement of NDCs a binding obligation. Again, you must pursue domestic measures, but achieving or implementing the agreement, the contribution is not a binding obligation. Now, these core mitigation commitments are common to all parties, but there is some differentiation in the expectations set for countries. Developed countries, the agreement says, should undertake absolute economy-wide reduction targets, while developing countries are encouraged to move toward economy-wide targets over time. And one of the final issues, in fact, in the negotiations was insistence that it should be should and not shall with respect to that expectation of absolute economy-wide targets, because a shall would have posed ratification issues for the U.S. Now, the agreement also, with respect to mitigation, does address market-based approaches without using those words. It requires that countries that use, quote, internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, unquote, to meet their NDCs have to ensure that there's no double counting going on. So there, that phrase, internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, is code for trading. In addition, the agreement creates a new mechanism that will likely be similar to the clean development mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol, but the specific terms of that are to be negotiated, and I am not fully confident that we will see those terms arrived at anytime soon. Now, in order to drive ambition going forward, the agreement establishes two linked processes, each on a 5-year cycle. First, there will be a global stocktake to assess collective progress, and following that, each party has to submit a new NDC informed by the outcomes of that global stocktake, and again, with the expectation that it will represent a progression. Now, under the agreement, which, as I said, starts in 2020, the first stocktake isn't scheduled until 2023, but the accompanying decision, as I said, there's a second piece to this package, this decision, and it jumpstarts this process with something called a facilitative dialogue in 2018, and then the first updated contributions are due 2 years later in 2020. So it effectively kickstarts that process later in this decade. Moving now to the transparency provisions of the agreement, and I think that along with the mitigation commitments and that ambition cycle, the 5-year cycle I just described, transparency is really the heart of this agreement because it's the means of accountability provided here. And again, in another move beyond bifurcation, the provisions here move beyond the present binary system to create a new system with common binding commitments for all parties. But at the same time, it provides for built-in flexibility to accommodate the different capacities of countries, which vary considerably. On the reporting side, all countries are required to submit emissions inventories, and to submit the information necessary to progress made in implementing and achieving their NDCs. So again, they're not committed, there's not a binding obligation to implement, but you have to submit information that makes it possible to track your progress. Then on the review side, these reports that are submitted will undergo first an expert technical review, and then each party is going to have to participate in a form of peer review that the agreement calls a facilitative multilateral consideration of progress. Again, what we're looking at here is progress in implementing and achieving these. The transparency provision promises support to developing countries to strengthen their capacity to generate and submit data. And the detailed terms of these transparency requirements are to be negotiated by 2018. I expect that the nature of the flexibility provided to developing countries under this system will be a central issue in negotiating the specific terms. In addition, the agreement creates a new mechanism, which is really a committee of experts, to facilitate implementation and to promote compliance. This is not a compliance system that is enforcement-based. The details of this also are to be negotiated, but the agreement makes clear that it will be non-adversarial and non-punitive. Moving now to the finance provisions of the agreement. Finance is always a contentious issue, and the dynamic in Paris was the poorer developing countries on the one hand wanting stronger assurances that support will be scaled up in the future, and developed countries, on the other hand, pushing for the wealthier developing countries to contribute as well. And I would say that both succeeded to some degree. The agreement commits developed countries to provide finance in continuation of their existing obligations under the convention. That's a key stipulation, that this is a continuation of existing obligations, key for the United States, so as not to create new binding financial commitments that require congressional approval of the agreement. So in addition to that reaffirmation of developed country commitments, the agreement also provides for other parties. It encourages other parties, in other words, developing countries, to provide such support voluntarily. This is the first time where you have an explicit call to developing countries to pitch in as well. Many, in fact, already are providing support to their fellow developing countries. China recently pledged $3 billion, and in Paris, Vietnam, for instance, pledged $1 million to the new Green Climate Fund. So this is something that's happening already. The agreement acknowledges it and encourages it to increase over time. Now, still on finance, beyond those general provisions, there was the issue of a quantified finance goal. Previously, developed countries had committed to mobilizing $100 billion a year in public and private resources by 2020. Developing countries wanted to ramp that up and wanted to create a 5-year cycle to keep revisiting the question of a quantified goal. The outcome here, and this is reflected not in the agreement but in the accompanying decision, was that developed countries agreed to extend the $100 billion goal through 2025, and the decision says that by 2025, parties will set a new collective quantified goal from a floor of $100 billion. So in other words, the expectation has been set a new higher goal for the period beyond 2025, but it does not speak to what happens after that. So there is not a continuous 5-year cycle. The agreement also includes provisions on adaptation that I won't get into, but one related aspect is loss and damage. Here the notion is that even with strong mitigation and adaptation efforts, some countries are facing severe, irreversible impacts over time. Previously, the parties had launched a mechanism, this was 2 years ago in Warsaw, to consider approaches to address this so-called loss and damage. The vulnerable countries had pushed very hard in Paris to bring this mechanism under the agreement as a standalone provision, and they succeeded in that. But the trade-off there was that at the insistence of the United States, the accompanying decision states very clearly that this provision does not involve or provide a basis for any liability or compensation. The U.S., and joined by other developed countries, wanted to keep the door firmly closed against any notion of legal liability or that there was a compensation mechanism being created here. Just how this mechanism will in fact address loss and damage is something still to be determined. Now, I want to note that beyond the formal outcomes here, the agreement and the decision, we saw a slew of announcements of new initiatives in Paris, including a commitment by 20 countries, including the U.S., to double public investment in clean energy R&D, and an initiative announced by Bill Gates and other billionaires to ramp up private investment. Those are just a couple of the many, many initiatives that were announced. Now, in terms of next steps, negotiations will continue next year on the operational details of the agreement. The agreement itself will have to be ratified by 55 countries, with representing 55% of global emissions, in order to enter into force. And bringing that back to the U.S., as many of you know, the U.S. system allows different domestic procedures for ratifying international. The one we are perhaps most familiar with is the submission of the agreement to the Senate for its advice and consent. But in fact, over the years, many, many international agreements have been ratified by the President acting alone. An agreement must be consistent with existing U.S. law for the President to do that under executive authority. And the U.S. has worked very hard in this case to make sure that the Paris Agreement meets that test. I would expect that we will hear some political debate around this question, but legally, in our view, there's nothing in the agreement that would preclude the President from accepting it on his own using his executive authorities. In terms of potential impacts on the private sector, I think the market-related provisions in the agreement should help to facilitate the growth of the global carbon market. I don't see any direct regulatory impact from this agreement on the private sector. But over time, I would say, the agreement could and actually hopefully will shift the political dynamic in a way that supports the strengthening of climate policy globally. I think the accountability provisions, the transparency measures, if they work the way they should, will provide stronger assurances to countries that all are contributing their fair share. And I think that, in turn, will enable each to do more, move us beyond the you first kind of dynamic. And I also think that the cycle provision will create a succession of political moments when pressure is again brought to bear, countries pressuring one another, and civil society pressuring them all. And that hopefully will keep us all moving forward with stronger efforts. As I said earlier, I don't think we'll be able to really judge the effect of this agreement for years, but I think we achieved what we needed to in Paris, and it will potentially be a transformative agreement.